ways to look at the future of AI in transportation. In the context of cities, we could think about certainly how it could be applied to some sort of public transport options. But of course, the one that is in the news and which people are very much aware of is autonomous driving, perhaps for passenger vehicles. Maybe we can, since we'll deal with the elephant in the room first. Chris, you are an expert, a pioneer in this area of autonomous driving. You have a lot of experience. Tell us how significant is this tragic case that happened in Tempe, Arizona, where a pedestrian was killed. And what do we understand about it? Again, you have no access to proprietary information, I appreciate that. But how do we make sense of it, and how significant a setback is this for what is otherwise a very promising technology?
Yeah, so I think first we have to think about the family involved. I think there's a relatively young woman was killed in Arizona when a self-driving vehicle struck her. I think I'd actually rather defer until we have more information. So, we don't have any inside information. The NTSB is involved, Uber's investigating with them and with the local authorities. And I think it would be difficult to draw any conclusions without actually having them, run the course of their investigation.
Is it fair to say, though, that society at large, holds a new technology like this to a different standard than we would if cars were being driven by humans? I mean, people are a terrible cause of accidents that lead to deaths by driving in the way that we drive. But it's not the most intuitive thing for us to say, well, how many lives could be saved versus 1 or 2 lost. That might be a rational perspective, but that's not at all going to carry the day in the court of public opinion, at least not yet. So how do you deal with that as a technologist and futurist?
Absolutely. And I think this is actually at the heart of why we're developing this technology. I've been working in the space for about 15 years, and from the earliest time, it was about saving lives. Back in 2003, I was working with the Defense Department on the the DARPA Grand Challenges. And at that time, the technology was intended to be used for supply convoys in areas of conflict. In the Iraq War, there were more people killed on the supply lines than there were on the front lines. And so by making that transportation safer, it would be profoundly important. Now that, over the last decade or so, I've been working on-road self-driving vehicles. And there, what's very easy to forget is the kind of tragic status quo. Globally, 1.2 million people die on the world's roads. In the US, it's somewhere between 35 and 40,000 people every year. In the US, that's the equivalent of a 737 crashing every day. We wouldn't accept that in air travel, and yet we do on the roads of America every day. And so I think the big picture that we have to focus on is that the status quo is not acceptable. That rate of safety is below what we would expect. The accessibility for 6 million Americans is limited because they don't have the physical ability or mental capacity to get around and have the same freedom that you and I take for granted. And that's really what the technology is about. And at our company, Aurora, that's our focus, is to get this technology out into the market safely, quickly, and broadly to have that, what I think is a huge social good impact.
So it sounds like you're undeterred, obviously, by this challenge that's being posed, not only by this incident, but more broadly, societal acceptance of new technology. It's sort of a deeper question. Yeah. We often find new technologies, no matter how wonderful they are, sometimes take time to gain social acceptance.
Absolutely, and I think what's interesting with automated technology and self-driving technology is we actually, my experience has been seeing the opposite. So you hear first, I think a recent survey said something like 60% of Americans wouldn't want to use a self-driving car. Well, that says that 40% of Americans would. And that's 200 and something million Americans that are excited about getting behind the wheel. I think I did my math right there. Excited about getting behind the wheel of a self-driving car or in a vehicle driven by somebody else. My experience has been that even the most kind of cautious people, the people who have the most doubts about this technology, once they experience it, very quickly get used to it. And my theory on this is that we're all used to driving in a self-driving car, right? So when you grow up, your parents drive the vehicle. And so you sit in there and you get from A to B, and you're not driving it. So for all intents and purposes, it's self-driving while you're fighting with your brother in the back seat or whatever your pastime happened to be. As you grow, as you get old, there's probably not a person in this room who hasn't either taken a taxi, a bus, or a Lyft. And so, that again is another form of self-driving vehicle. And this is yet, kind of just the next evolution of that. What I've seen in the field, we've done a lot of user testing, and that, you'll get somebody in who's very anxious about the technology. Get them in one of these vehicles. Back at Google, we did a test trial where we had people use the vehicles for between a day and a week. And invariably, they'd get in the car, and it would get on the 101 freeway in the Bay Area. Be driving down the road at 65 miles an hour. They would spend a few minutes, and it would be a little anxious. And then about 10 minutes in, they'd kind of turn and say, is this all it does? Just drives down the road. It's like, well, it's a self-driving car. Yes, that's really all it does. And then within about a day or 2 days, they would come to the conclusion that it was actually a better driver than they are. And this leads actually to the kind of opposite problem, which is that very quickly people overtrust the technology. And so that's why the bar for safety and the capability has to be high, because we can't count on the people in the vehicles when these vehicles become very highly performant to actually be there to backstop the technology.
So let's take that thought. We've talked about passenger vehicles mostly with the discussion so far, but autonomy and other AI-enabled capabilities are going to come to trucks. We've seen, Elon Musk unveil the Beast. Some of you would have seen the launch of the autonomous truck. But GE's rail is quite pervasive and famous. So you have lots of history, decades of history in this industry. Can you tell us a little bit about how you're thinking about autonomy and some of the implications, with analogies maybe to how we have autopilot on planes and so on? What is the status of, say, freight locomotives? How automated are they now, and what are some of the challenges you have to advancing that?
Sure, absolutely. So we have the same kind of challenges. There's a cultural difference, right? This is a new way to actually look at your job and how you actually have done it for decades. I mean, this is not a young industry, and it's a very traditional industrial, which is slower to innovate. But we really have brought a lot of technology to bear on automating the train, the handling of a train, the makeup of a train, going through in and out of yards so that it's more efficient, because there's a lot to be had in the industry from both emissions and fuel usage by doing this automation. From where we are right now, everybody's probably heard about PTC, positive train control, that is going into play that will actually help ensure that you're staying within safe driving limits. But we currently have technology on board locomotives. We have what we call smart locomotives. There's a lot of data. We've got a mobile compute platform, so to speak, where you can do edge analytics as you're driving to find out what's going on with the train at all times. We have cameras that pick up, just like we have in cars, right, that help you park and things. It picks up data about the tracks that we can go and analyze and say, you need to go fix this or bend it or do something to it so that you can go faster and safer through long corridors. These trains are up to 3 miles long. 7,000 to 20,000 pounds. They take a little bit to handle, and there's resistance to doing, moving too quickly and going to autonomy. But we are moving that direction, and there's several steps that it's going to take to get there. It will take a few years, but right now you have a limited crew on board. We've got communication systems that are, go from the head of the train to the end of the train, so that you can imagine these things going through the mountains and up and down, so you can actually apply brakes automatically to make sure you got the right power in the right place, so you get higher fuel efficiency and you're still going safely. You've got what we call Trip Optimizer, which is a cruise control for trains. And again, this is where the culture comes in, because it's really difficult for engineers.
New technologies? I mean, it sounds pretty commonplace in, for example, planes with autopilot or even cruise control in cars. Is this an industry that is in need of a leapfrog?
It's kind of been leapfrogging, but not leapfrogging. There will be a leapfrog to come when we get to autonomous, but we're building it carefully because, again, it's a slow-moving industry for all the right purposes. You need to be safe. And there are a lot of benefits to be had by getting to full autonomy. But that's going to take, I think, a few more steps to get there. So it's not a leapfrog. It's building blocks in my mind. Taking these technologies, because some have been around for some time, like the distributed power mechanism has been out since the early 70s. This cruise control came into bear about 2009, 2010, and it's got 20,000 installations around the globe. And I think we will continue to see this become more and more pervasive as trucking becomes more of a competitive threat to the industry.
Right.
These are becoming more and more imperatives because you can get safer, longer trains that are more fuel efficiency. And for the industry, every mile per hour that you can increase the speed of a train safely is worth about $2.5 million to the industry. And every decrease of dwell of cars that are sitting in a yard, that's also another $2 billion plus to the industry. So they can be more competitive. And really what we need to get to is that FedEx-like, I can be guaranteed, as a shipper, my goods are going to get from A to B through all the kinds of automation tools that we're bringing to bear, including
Right.
visibility, to make sure that you know when they're going to be. Right now, there's a lot of disconnected systems. So I think that it's not a leapfrog, it's they need to catch up. We need to catch up, and we've got the technologies to do it.
And you talked about some cultural resistance. How much of it is companies versus, for example, labor unions or the operators? What are the real issues here?
Well, so there's a mix, right? I mean, traditionally, the big Class 1 railroads have been very independent. There's only a handful of them in the U.S., and they're competitive. So they haven't really wanted to or seen the need to actually share and collaborate to the extent that you've seen like in trucking and through different types of enterprises. That's coming. There's also a labor aspect to it because it's, again, a longstanding traditional labor group that also wants to make sure that they're protected. So that's not pushing it to stop. It's just something you have to work through.
Great. So let's come back to Danielle. You look after something called the Department of Innovation and Technology here, in addition to being Chief Information Officer. So we've talked a little bit about this urban dimension of it, but let's focus on the transport aspect. You, I think, have a very interesting project or tender underway looking for rapid transit to get from the airport to downtown. Am I right? Can you tell us a little bit about it and what makes it interesting and innovative?
Sure. So through the Chicago Infrastructure Trust, which is a nonprofit organization that was founded in part by the city to improve our urban infrastructure and find different models by which to fund and invest in that infrastructure over time. So this particular project that they're doing is currently in open procurement, so I can't talk too much about it, but I can talk about sort of the general goals. So the goal is to, we have 20,000 people a day who travel between our central business district here and O'Hare Airport, and some of you are probably part of that group that have traveled here today or are traveling back here today. And so, how do we move that quantity of people in a way that eases congestion, potentially reducing the amount of cars on the road, getting people to their destination more quickly, creating more of that frictionless experience. So really the goal is to, and be able to scale with the growth of what we see coming down the road, right? So it's 20,000 today, it may be 35,000 in 2045, and how do we really adapt and be forward-thinking enough to address how we're going to move that population over time? So really the goal is to get people frequently to, from the central business district to O'Hare more quickly, right? So 20 minutes. And every 15 minutes, then the goal is...
Have you given them targets on time?
There's targets, right? So get there within 20 minutes and have that transport leave in about every 15 minutes so that it's more frequent, it's faster. Again, you have that better experience, and we're getting people in and out more effectively.
And they can't use the existing surface roads, or else they would just clog up the roads, or
so
you haven't put that
the RFP, I think, doesn't, you have the option to be above or below ground. It doesn't specify. So it's up to...
If I just get a fleet of cars and offer services.
So this is for high-speed rail.
Right, so it has to be some form of
yes,
high-speed
exactly,
rail.
high-speed rail, sorry.
But it could be, as you say, below ground. I think the Boring Company has expressed interest.
Yes, so...
It's Elon Musk's company, of course.
The Chicago Infrastructure Trust just narrowed down to two proposers. So it's the Boring Company and O'Hare Express LLC who will be submitting proposals.
One of them wants to go above ground, is it? And the other below ground? Remains to be seen.
Yes, remain to be seen.
Okay,
yes.
all right. We'll let you have your secrets. In any case, you may very well be getting here in some futuristic transport when we have our conferences in future at this delightful venue. So that's very interesting. But I'm interested in what motivated the city to take this approach to encourage. Clearly, you want to encourage us because there are airport express trains all over the world, right? London, Singapore, Hong Kong. They've had them for at least 20 years. They work very well. why not just cut and paste?
Sure.
Why do you feel the need to do something different?
Well, and I think in this particular model also, so the cost won't be borne by the taxpayers, right? So the system will need to be funded by fares and or advertising in combination, but it must not exceed the cost of taking a taxi or a ride share to the airport, so that we're making sure that this is something that is more accessible form of transportation for more people.
And is your expectation that this will be autonomous, or it doesn't have to be? You're agnostic
Again,
about
I think remains to be seen.
Remains to be seen. All right, okay. Right, okay, so that's very interesting. More broadly, when you look at the future of transportation in the city, what do you see AI playing a role in the embedding in sensors, for example, in smart mesh networks and sort of feedback loops that might help solve problems like traffic and parking and related issues that are still, ye olde world problems, they're still with us?
Absolutely. So, I think having the more data we have, the more data points we can collect about our built environment or what's happening, those activities in our environment are critically important. I think we heard you talk about some of the analytics that you're collecting about the track conditions and other things, so that you're able to more proactively make decisions. So we're doing the same thing in the city with our infrastructure, with the public way and those public assets. How do we better target our investments in that infrastructure over time? If we know how it's performing, we can make those better investments. So the smart lighting project is one example of where we're converting that system to LED, but then also we'll have sensors that let us know exactly where there are problems, so that we can better direct our resources to it. And then there are tools like the array of things that we're deploying, which is the citywide sensor network across the city that will also have edge analytics and computing embedded there. How can we leverage that to assist with Vision Zero goals? So Vision Zero is a plan that the city has, and many other cities have, to reduce pedestrian and other vehicle crashes that result in serious or fatal injuries to zero. How do we do that? We only have a certain amount of data now. We know where and when crashes have occurred. We don't always know when there has been a near miss. So we can leverage something like the array of things to use the camera and the microphone to identify near misses and have better resolution of information to help us do problem solving. And again, I think it's that having that data, whether it be a human behind the wheel or an AI, understanding how that activity is performing allows us to make better decisions, allows us to affect policy change, in a way that's going to impact our residents and with all the right things in mind.
That's fascinating. It raises a question in my mind about the role of the public sector versus the private sector, in particular. For example, we want to go to Chris on this, in furthering autonomous driving. Obviously, there's a robust competition amongst technology companies to develop their own approach. They have different, some are betting on LiDAR, others are not using LiDAR, and so on. So different technology pathways. It's anarchic, it's great, it's a spirit of innovation. But at the same time, you're dealing with the commons, right? The city's streets are public property typically, and there's an authority, in the case of the city or some other authority. What do you think is the right way for, again, that hyper-competitive private sector to coordinate with the government, and what's already working that you see around the world?
So I guess I don't know what the prescription is, right, in detail, but I think it's essential. So the technology today, despite the headlines, isn't deployed, right? There's early testing that's happening in Phoenix, Arizona. My model is that this is actually one of a tremendous opportunity for public transit. So I should have done my research beforehand and understood what the economics were in Chicago, but in LA, something like 90% of the cost of transportation is subsidized either at the federal, state, or local level. So you pay $1 and there's $9 worth of other charge coming into that through external sources.
For public transport.
For public transportation, right, on a per mile, a per
Right.
seat mile basis. And so I think that there's a real opportunity both to serve the public better by using smaller vehicles where you've reduced the cost of operation through automation. And also to get the cost of that down to the point where it's no longer needs to be subsidized. And I think at that point you can have a public-private partnership where the economics make sense and where you're actually serving the citizens of the city. But to do that, you have to have the conversations, obviously, with the local authorities and the transit authorities and kind of build it into what I think will ultimately be a mixed modal solution of high density transportation on cores that make sense, and then last mile or point to point in off hours.
And in terms of the actual data point that we were discussing before, people talked about roads that would be smart roads, or the vision for the future has no limits, and some of these things will obviously have to be done by public investment, or at least coordinated by public rules. What are you betting on, or what would you like to see that would further these sort of set of autonomous technologies you're working on that the government or public policy should do?
So my philosophy around the smart roads has been, let's not wait, right? Build the technology to work with the infrastructure as it exists today. And then after we show the value to society, both in terms of safety, accessibility, and cost, then we can have deeper conversations about longer term planning horizons around how do we make the infrastructure smarter. Because, like we saw I didn't personally see, but when we kind of moved from the horse and buggy to the automobile, we didn't kind of build the road network first and then say, okay, now let's figure out what to do with it. We got tired of cars getting stuck in the mud, and so we decided, okay, let's actually start to build the interconnects between the cities and pave these, and that led to kind of a golden age of interstate commerce. And so I think that the same evolutionary pathway has to happen here. Get the technology on the road in probably what will be its most expensive and complicated form first, see the benefit of it, and then start to have the public sector step in to improve the efficiency of that as a good for all.
I mean, Laurie, in your industry, you already have a smart road. It's called the rail, right?
Yeah, it's there.
It's well defined. What can be done aside from the things you talked about inside the locomotive cabin, as it were? If you move beyond that to make the system much more intelligent, and is there again a public role in any of that, or basically you're not expecting any kind of public role and you kind of have to do it yourself?
Probably not expecting much from a public perspective, but we do have dedicated roads, rail, which is the rail, of course. But what the industry, what we're helping to shape is connecting those from a visibility standpoint. You've got trains that have to meet and pass and do certain things, and that visibility is not always shared as broadly as it can be. It's only when they get closer. So some of the things, technologies they're innovations that will help see the whole landscape, almost like an air traffic control system for rail, is in the works right now. And part
Will
of
it be manned by your people or by your customers?
it will be customers. I mean, the customers. I mean, they want this in their
know
own
their
hands.
business,
Yeah, we
right?
build the technology. They know their business and they run it. We're just helping them, compete in the future and move to the next level.
Right.
And that visibility is really one of the keys, I think, to that next step, right? Is you need to have visibility across from shipper all the way to a port, and all the handoffs that go on between the big rail systems and then to truckers it's hard to imagine, but it's fairly manual. I mean, you have to go to a lot of different places to check and see when things are coming in. And one of the things that we've launched recently with the Port of Los Angeles and now with the Port of Long Beach is this visibility port optimization tool where you take all the shipments coming in from bills of ladings, and they can get from a visible and to truckers, go to one place, and shippers and trains to know exactly what's coming in more than 2 days before it's going to get there, which is what it has been traditionally for forever. And now you can have 14 to 28 days. Because these ships aren't, you've got a lot of lead time, but that sharing of data just hasn't been there across the whole network. So
Right.
We're starting to see this unfold. The timing is right, and we're really excited about what it's going to take us.
Now, is there any, I was at a recent event where some logistics companies were talking about the use of blockchain for that purpose, in particular, bill of lading and customs forms, sending them in advance. Are you looking at that, or do you know people in the industry that are working on that specifically?
Yeah, we're actually looking at that as well, and there's several groups that have been formed around blockchain. One that we've joined is the transportation group that has most of the class ones and a lot of the big shipping lines, FedEx, DHL, and a few others, that we're looking at how do we start and where do we start, how do we start getting this surface. And in the meantime, and I think it will come, we're building tools that are actually providing some of that now. It's how do we connect it in a more open environment, take advantage of the blockchain technology as it starts to unfold.
Interesting. Are either of the two of you looking at any applications of blockchain, and is it relevant at all for what you're doing? Anything the city's doing?
Absolutely, I think that we're also interested in it. I think there's particularly a good use case around properties and managing properties, and we're not the sole folks that have interest in properties. I mean, the county, there are other governments involved in that as well. So I think that's when a technology like blockchain becomes so powerful is to have that kind of structure in place. So we are definitely interested in exploring that.
One question that I wanted to ask Chris, this is getting a little bit into the weeds, but there is a debate on autonomous driving, on whether to rely strictly on a technology we talked about on an earlier panel, cameras only, or that you must use LiDAR. And what do you think about that debate, and how risky a technology bet is it for, in the case of Tesla most famously, to use one technology and basically almost everyone else is relying on the other?
Yeah, I guess I would say that I believe you want to make the problem as easy as possible, right?
Sorry, say again?
I think you want to make the problem as easy as possible,
right,
and you want to make the vehicles as safe as possible. And so the sensing technologies you normally hear about are laser or LiDAR, radar, and vision systems. And each of them has different benefits and different failure modes. And so by combining 3 different sensing modalities along with prior knowledge about the environment through the form of maps, you can actually build a system that's going to be more robust, more quickly, than anything that relies on any one of them. In the very long term, is it likely that we'll be able to develop these systems with vision only? Probably. But even then, there's limitations. So if you're driving down the road at night in a cloudless or a cloudful sky, you can't see that far. And certainly your headlights have some bound. And so adding radar technology, adding other forms of sensing to it beyond just cameras will actually make those vehicles safer as well. And so I wholeheartedly believe you want to use all the sensing capability you can bring to bear.
So you're a believer in having as much safety on board. Obviously, the trade-off is cost, if I'm not mistaken.
Absolutely. And there's a lot made about the cost, but it's a red herring argument, right? So people talk about the fact that a LiDAR sensor today is $100,000. Oh my goodness, how could we possibly, put that in a vehicle? Well, it turns out that if you buy a very high-end camera that they make 100 of them a year or 1,000 of them a year, they're still $100,000. But that if you actually engineer the system and bring it down so it fits in your pocket in a phone, they're $5 a piece or $10 a piece. And the same is true with LiDAR. It's going to follow the same kind of trajectory that camera systems have, that radar systems have. There's nothing kind of unobtainium in there. It's not like we have to make them all out of platinum and gold and diamonds. It's just a bit of electronics.
Think economies of scale alone
engineering economies of scale
without future technological breakthroughs per se.
No, none needed.
And but to get to it's a chicken and egg problem, right? So the first 10,000 cars you make are going to have that very expensive cost.
Well, they're going to have a comparatively expensive, but even 10,000 cars. If you look at the volumes of LiDARs made today, there may be 10,000 made a year. Right. If you have auto manufacturers making 10,000 every year or 100,000 a year, that's going to drive it down because that will be one mode or one particular version of it. And even the sensors that they sell for however many they sell them for today, that's an 80% profit margin. So there's a lot of room to collapse the cost on these things.
So if it's not this question of sensing, it sounds like you're pretty relaxed about it, that the pathway is clear and economics are going to work. What is the biggest challenge that you face to your vision? What's the hard problem?
So there's 2 parts. So one is it's just a hard problem. So much like my colleagues on the stage, we're dealing with a problem that isn't unidimensional. So you can't just build a better camera or laser or radar. You can't even just build a better driving system. The system has to interact with the automobile, which is produced by somebody else. And that's in itself, an incredibly complicated mechanism. And then it has to come to market in a way that makes sense. And my belief is, as you mentioned, the initial units will probably be more expensive than the later ones. The good news is in a model like a public transportation service, the economics make sense even with expensive components early on. So I guess the hardest part for me is just the complexity and the breadth of the engineering problem coupled with the kind of impedance mismatch with market and trying to bring a technology that's innovating very rapidly into a marketplace, the automotive ecosystem, where the engineering cycles are much longer and kind of the glide path to integration is much longer.
Thank you. A question for Lori. Rail has had an advantage in cost traditionally, but I'm hearing from a number of the autonomous truck manufacturers. A number of companies are investing in that technology, particularly if they're doing convoys of trucks and so on. They're making the case that it'll be cheaper than rail. And for long distance, I'm sure there's some footnotes and caveats involved on certain long-haul routes and certain kind of loads and so on. But the very idea that again, the U.S. has this vast and very important backbone of rail freight, that if you're going to be undermined on cost by technology, that could be a real disruption to your business model. Sure. How do you, the things you've talked about mission control and cruise control, how far do they go towards it? I understand why they're attractive, but in terms of cost, bottom line cost, where do you see your position when you tell your clients 5 years or 10 years from now, we can be X% less cost per mile or per ton? How do you think about it?
So we can even say that now. I mean, this trip optimizer that I mentioned earlier, that's deployed globally in a lot of locomotives, it can get anywhere from an 8 to 13% EPA certified fuel savings.
Fuel savings.
Fuel
okay.
savings, which is really important. And again, there's a cultural aspect of actually allowing the cruise control to work without intervening because it will do a better job. So I think back to your point about trucking, they're doing platooning where you've got a lead truck and then you've got like a mini train. The amount of freight that they can carry is nowhere near what a train can. A 7,000 to 20,000 ton train can carry that. Trucks I don't know that they're going to get to that level anytime soon. And for
I hate to see a 3-mile convoy, 18-wheeler.
They'd have to have their own road. So, and I think that's something they might be thinking about. But on rail, it's already there. It's already dedicated. It's well known, and they're pretty optimized routes. And I think that the unlocking the value is around, again, the connection points across the big 6 or 7 Class 1 railroads and sharing of information that will allow them to have the visibility to actually move faster. Because every mile, like I said earlier, every 1 mile per hour faster they go is worth to the industry, and I don't have it broken down to a train, $2.5 billion. So that savings comes out, which makes them more fuel efficient. They're already more cost effective.
This is the entire fleet of trains going 1 mile an hour faster, is it?
1 mile. So, and the average speed is 30, which is pretty slow. It's because of what they have to go through yards and terminals and the handoffs. If you can speed that up just a little bit, and the velocity we can get in terminals and handoffs from automation and from some of the smart technologies that we're putting in place, will allow them to be even more price competitive. I think really this is service levels, though. They need to be able to guarantee, and that's how you compete with knowing your delivery is going to get there when you want to. We all want that.
No, I'd be remiss if I didn't ask, you're not in the passenger business, but Amtrak's had a few crashes, notably in the last year or two, that affect societal acceptance of things like faster trains.
Yeah, or autonomous.
Or in autonomous, of course. So how do you, where does the analogy end with your business of freight and your customers that you're dealing with, transporting freight, with sort of the mess that is Amtrak and how they operate, and how do you navigate that problem? Again, technology doesn't live in a vacuum; it's in a social context.
Right. I mean, it affects all of us. I mean, all of our perception and rail. Our customers take this extraordinarily serious. I mean, safety is their top priority. Service level is probably second, and then cost effectiveness is third. Those are usually three top things that they are concerned about. And as we're going through this transition with putting in positive train control, and those are hooking into our systems for cruise control, all those types of things will ensure more safety so trains don't get too close together. There's some futuristic concepts that are applied in a lot of parts of the rest of the world in transit called moving blocks, so they can never get too close together. They actually control
How does that
the
work,
train.
actually, the moving block?
Yeah, there's a set amount of distances, so all the routes is kind of like, again, air traffic control. You're following a flight plan, and you've got, everybody knows, the traffic controller knows exactly where you're going to be so you don't have collisions and it can reroute you. This moving block concept is the same kind of concept, that you would actually have the visibility from routes and trains, and everybody would know if it's getting too close, it slows the train down for you. So the positive train control is hooking into the brakes so that it has a route plan that knows what the speeds are, and then it knows where the trains are, and will actually keep you that distance apart.
Danielle, Chicago is the industrial heartland, the crossroads for American industry. How would you receive, and transportation particularly, and logistics, how would you receive a pitch like this that we can increase the speed of freight trains and make them safer. What's the government regulatory perspective on this?
And I think from our perspective, I mean, safety is obviously a top priority. We are interested in, in promoting and supporting new innovative technologies and companies who are developing them. We're also interested in, working on solving problems, right? So if it's also helping to solve a real problem within a community, that's where it's going to be most meaningful. And then I think the other thing that we're very interested in is the data sharing aspect. So you talked about the transformation within your industry of that data sharing, but I think for us to be able to work with private sector folks to share that information, to make that information open also, right? Because I think that transparency also will help with some of the, address certain concerns, right? If you can demonstrate through the data that's being collected, we can, all work together to deploy these technologies in a way that's going to benefit our residents or your customers.